worship. So if you think about it, it's like the posture of worship is very much just full surrender. It's laying your life down. It's a lifestyle. It's not just when we come and sing and come together corporately and worship God together. It's more about our life is given to God, and our life then is given as an act of worship to Him, of full surrender. So obedience to God, which means that as the Lord of our lives, that we just seek to follow after Him and do the things that He puts in front of us, to understand His word and His ways, His will, and to do our very best with His help to walk that out with Him. And I don't know if I read this last week. I'm not sure if I did, but 1 Chronicles 15:13. And this is when David was bringing the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem. And if you remember that story about how the Ark had been taken captive in the time of Eli and his sons, this was actually before there was a king, King Saul. And Samuel was kind of the judge and ruling over Israel at that time. And they were in a battle with the Philistines, and Eli allowed the Ark of the Covenant to be taken from the tabernacle, and they took it to the front lines of the battle, the Israelites battling the Philistines. And during that battle, they lost. His sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were killed, and the Ark was taken captive. And that's a whole story in and of itself about how in the Philistines, they had 5 major cities, and the first place that they took the Ark, there were all kinds of horrible things that broke out. Like they had tumors, they had boils. Actually, they put it in the temple of, I don't know if you pronounce it Dagon or Dagon, but they're a false god, the temple in the Philistine country. And in the morning when they came back, the god had fallen over on its face. And they set it back up, and the next day it had fallen over and its hands were broken off. And so they were like, we have to get rid of this Ark of the Covenant, which was the embodiment of the very presence of God for the Israelites. And they moved it from city to city, and things happened where they wanted to get rid of they wanted just to get rid of it. So, and of course, I'm just telling you this story just because I love going down these trails of telling stories. But they ended up saying, okay, we're going to put the Ark on a cart, and we're going to have it pulled by a cow that has a calf, meaning that it's going to be walking away even though it needs to relieve itself of the milk for the calf to drink from its mother. And they said, if this cow walks up the road towards, the territory of Israel, then we'll know that it was right for us to send the Ark of the Covenant back, and that we shouldn't keep it in our possession. So it did happen that way. Like the cow, walks up the hill, even though it's lowing and mooing because it's heavy with milk, and really would want to go back to its stall where its calf could drink the milk. So the Ark of the Covenant was not back in the tabernacle all during this time. And so David at one point decided he was going to move the Ark into the tabernacle he had built for it inside the city of Jerusalem. And the first time he did it, he put it on a cart, and they're walking along and they're praising God, they're celebrating, they're playing music. And it's not the time that you think of where David danced before the Lord with all his might. He was probably dancing before the Lord, but this was the time when the cart went over a particular area, and they were concerned, whoever was following around thought that the cart was going to topple and the Ark was going to fall off. So this person reached up and studied. He was a Levite. He reached up and he studied the Ark on the cart, and he died instantly. Well, David was really angry about this, and he, left the Ark of the Covenant where it was and didn't continue to bring it into Jerusalem. Well, what was the deal here? Here they are. They're doing something. He's doing something wonderful, saying, I value the presence of God, and I want to bring the Ark of the Covenant into the tent, the tabernacle of David that I built. And I want to do this because I have such a high value for you, God. I have such a high value for the presence of God. And so he couldn't, at first he was angry. He couldn't figure it out. He was mad because of the death of the Levite who was only trying to keep the Ark from falling off the cart. Well, the bottom line of this was that they didn't take time to find out what is your way that the ark is to be transported. And God had prescribed that the ark, and you can discover this way back when you read in when Moses was first given all of these things, and he built the tabernacle in the wilderness, and that became the center of worship for the Israelites. And they built it, prescribed by God, where there was a holy of holies that separated the ark from the rest of the temple and the tabernacle. It was a tent. But the prescribed way that the ark would be carried would be poles that went down each side of the ark, and it was carried on the shoulders of the Levites. So they would put the poles in, they wouldn't touch the ark, and then they would put themselves under it, lift it up, and they would carry the ark and never touch it with the on their shoulders with the posts that went through. So that was the prescribed way that God had. So why am I bringing this up? Why did it tell that story? Well, number one, I like to tell the Bible stories. But number two, it's this idea of obedience is a demonstration of our worship to God. Like, we are not going before God and bringing him whatever we choose to bring him. And certainly we can choose to worship God. So that's not what I'm getting at. I'm getting at the fact that we would find out, God, what pleases you? Like, how would you like me to bring my sacrifice of praise? How would you prescribe? What are your ways in which you receive worship? So you could go all the way back to the story of Cain and Abel. And Cain and Abel were the two first sons of Adam and Eve. And they both brought a sacrifice to God. Or you could say they both brought something of themselves to worship God with what they were bringing. Because that's basically what a sacrifice would be. It would be, I am offering this, I'm giving you something of value, God, and this is my worship. So Cain and Abel both brought something different. Abel brought an animal to the life of the animal, like to slay the animal, to burn the animal. This was the sacrifice. It was an animal sacrifice. And Cain brought the fruit of the land. So he brought some vegetables and, whatever he was growing in the land. And the Bible says that God did not receive the sacrifice of Cain, but he did receive the sacrifice of Abel. And Cain was absolutely incensed by this. He was angry. And then he ends up killing his brother because of his anger. And the thing is that you look back and you might say, well, that doesn't seem fair. Like, why would God only receive Abel's sacrifice and not receive Cain's? Well, I feel, even though it's not stated specifically, I feel that Abel was bringing the offering that God requested. And Cain was bringing what he chose to bring. Like, he did not acknowledge or follow after what God had revealed was the proper sacrifice that was his worship to bring to God. And that's that idea of our obedience is actually our worship. So when God lays something out and says, this is how I want you to come before me, and of course, that's not exactly how it is for us now, but I'm talking about Cain and Abel. And God is saying, this is how you come before me. This is how you bring your sacrifice. This is how you bring your worship to me. And you decide, I'm not going to do what God said. I can bring him what I want. Like, I'm going to bring him what I'm growing in my garden and he's going to like it. Well, God was like, no, I don't receive that because I asked you to bring this to me. And so the same thing, with whether it was David and the Levites bringing the ark the way God had prescribed, or whether it was Cain and Abel bringing the offering that God had prescribed for them to bring. And for us, it's this idea of we're not just going to determine in and of ourselves what we will give God and what we won't give God. Because once again, our worship is we give him everything. We lay our entire lives down for God. That is our worship. And in no way is there room for us to say, I will give God this part of my day, or I'll give him this couple hours of my day, and that is my worship. How many times, and this was probably typical in the church that I grew up in, that we actually called our Sunday morning service our worship service. So yes, we came together and everything that we did was worshiping God, whether we were listening to the word, listening to the message, singing hymns, doing our responsive reading, praying, whatever it was, we were doing it as an act of worship to God. But that kind of separates it in a way that you could say, well, I have segmented an hour or two of my week to worship God. And I consider that when I take that time and I go to church and I gather with other believers and we sing together, we hear the word together. But God actually says your worship is your life. So our worship is everything. And that comes with this posture of everything I am and everything I have, God, it belongs to you. And so I'm not going to decide which part of me I'm going to give to you, because the day I gave my life to you, at least to the best of my ability, I gave you all of me. And that was my act of worship. That was me laying down my life, that living sacrifice on the altar, saying my life is no longer mine and I give it to you as a sacrifice. And I would imagine that God is pleased with that when we give him our best. We give him all of us. We give him our all. And so that is coming down to the fact that we don't just give God what we decide we'll give him. It's like even when you give your finances, it's like, I think if we had an attitude that everything we have has been given to us by God, that we don't just decide like what part we'll give him. Like, why not have an attitude that it's all yours, and that we give what we should, and we give what we want to give up and beyond that. But we also consider him, like always, what do you want? Like our giving should be an act of worship as well. And so maybe, I would say probably it would be easy. I could say that would be maybe all of our stories if we've been walking with the Lord a long time. Like we could write our tithe checks out, or bring our offerings every week into our church home. And it could get to the point where you're just writing that check, it's just a habit. But why not take time and look at that check, or look at that cash that you're going to give, or even now, like you can text to give, or you can give online. Everything can be digital. Everything can be online. But if you thought about as you're giving, like you take a moment and you worship God with it, like, so for me, and if you go to Grace, you've probably heard me say that I'm old-fashioned, and I love writing out our tithe check. We do pay our tithe check twice a month because we get paid twice a month. So we pay our tithe on the gross of our income, and so we know what our tithe is every 2 weeks, and then in between I give offerings, and I write the check, but it's us, Jerry and I both. We are giving, when we give our offerings, we are usually giving finances to maybe when we had the roof campaign recently, I give offerings every week to that. Now we're receiving money offerings to repave our parking lot, and that's going to be as much as the roof. So it's almost like that's a lot of money, but God supplied every bit of that. Going back to my offering, writing that check. So I give it to benevolence, which, our church will help members in need, primarily people that are in our church and we know them. They're part of our church. Maybe they're going through a hard time, and we help people like pay some of their electric bills, or make sure they have food for the week, or those kinds of things. But so I do offerings, and they're designated towards sometimes special offering requests like the roof or like the parking lot, or to the benevolence fund. So Jerry and I give regularly to that. So all of that could be done almost like, oh yeah, I just do this, every week I write a check and put it in an offering envelope and just, fill it out and put it in. But what if all of us, no matter which method in which we're giving, what if we took that check and we just really offered it as our worship to God? Like I just can imagine how much more, what a blessing our giving would become as we think of it, not just as something that we do in a habit, but something we do as worship. So when we give our tithe, it's like, God, this is 10% of all our increase, and we are so blessed to be able to bring this to you. And this is something that, Jerry and I have been doing probably within the first year after we gave our lives to God. We began to tithe. Once we understood, it's interesting, you think you didn't understand what it meant, because we actually, in the very beginning, we took our tithe, we figured our tithe out, which was a huge deal. Because when we first got saved, like we would say, okay, we didn't have that much money either. So for one thing, we might put $10 in the offering and think, this is a really big deal. And then we probably graduated to 20, but it wasn't our tithe. And so then I think we understood what the tithe was maybe within 6 months or so of giving our lives to God and going to church on a regular basis. And so then what we did, still incorrect, we figured out what our tithe was, and we thought, you know what, we could spend some of our tithe and we could give it to ministries that are offering books, or at that time it would be like cassette tapes. We could buy a cassette tape series from Kenneth Copeland Ministries or PTL Club, if you can remember back in those days. I'm talking about 1980, 1981. And we thought, you know what, there was actually, I think one of the things we did with our tithe money was we sent it to the PTL Ministries that was in North Carolina. And I think they were offering like a full Bible on tape. So it was, I think the guy's name was Ephraim Zimbalist Jr., if you remember that. He had a great speaking voice. I think he was an actor, an older man at the time. And he had recorded the Bible on cassette tape. And I believe that's what we spent some of our tithe money on. We thought, this is amazing. Like, we're going to take our tithe money. We figured out what our tithe should be, and we're going to buy the Bible on cassette tape. And then it wasn't long after that we realized a tithe isn't something that you are spending money to get something for yourself. And in this case, we thought, this is amazing. I mean, this is the Bible. It is given to God, like without question. And so it's like you just figure out what it is and then you give it to God. It's what he's asked for. And I know there's a lot of arguments and, people have different ways of thinking of the tithe. And I don't mind that at all. Like everybody can figure it out for themselves, what they should do. But for me personally, I find a great deal of freedom in just having a baseline of, we don't even consider the first 10% of everything that comes our way. We immediately give that back to our church. And then just, stretching ourselves to give up and beyond that in offerings. And then sometimes there's special needs that come up. Like we have ministry friends that have projects that are going on. And then Jerry and I will say, God, we'll talk to each other and we'll pray about it. And we'll say, God, what would you like us to give? But whether it's your tithe or whether it's offerings, how about we stop and think about that? And instead of doing it just as a habit, why don't we think about that and say, God, the finances that I bring to you, whether it's tithes or offerings that go up and beyond that 10%, that I do that as an act of worship. This represents something that is near and dear to me. And I could spend this money. We could spend our money in all kinds of different ways. But I want to give this to you first before any other expenditure. And I know for Jerry and I really didn't intend to go down this little road talking about giving, but I think it's really an important issue to really address, like the worship of our giving to God. I forgot what I was going to say about, maybe I was just going to say, like when we first understood what tithing was, and then within 6 months we were, at Bible school, and that was in itself a huge step of faith for us because of just the ability to work. I knew I wasn't supposed to get a job outside the home. I had a little one that moved down there with us, our first son, Aaron. And then I had Carrie at the end of that first year of Bible school. We were down there 2 years. I didn't go to school also because I knew God had spoken to me, like, your assignment now is to be a wife and a mother and to stay in the home. So I knew that was my assignment while I was doing all that, and I did that for years and years and years. And I invested myself in learning the Word of God. I ingested the Word of God. I read Jerry's notes. I read the books that he had assigned to him through his classes at Rhema. And I was growing alongside of him. I just couldn't take the classes. But anyway, the tithe was difficult in that way because we had made a commitment that it was going to be our joy to give. In fact, there's a tagline which Jerry and I didn't even come up with. It shows on our giving screen when we receive our offering at church. At the bottom, it says, "Generosity is our joy." And I love that because Jerry and I have determined that we are going to obey what we saw in the word concerning the tithe, and also in the area of offerings, where God could ask us to give an offering, or we could determine in and of ourselves to give an offering. But the tithe was never even a consideration. It was going to be given back to God, to the church that we attended. And of course, at the time, we weren't pastoring the church, we were attending church. And there were times, I remember one time in particular, where I don't remember the circumstance of it, but we didn't have the money to write that tithe check. And actually, our tithe check at the time was, I think it was just $30. And maybe that was a weekly tithe. So there was a $30 tithe that we were not able to make at the time. And we paid it later. Like, we made it up soon after. But here's the thing, is that Jerry and I were so determined and committed that once we began to obey God with this, that we would never step away from that. We would continue to be faithful, bringing our tithe into the storehouse. And so that time when, I don't remember the details, but the time we weren't able to do it, I cried about it. Like, Jerry and I were really upset about that. But we just told God, God, as soon as we're able to, that check will go to the church. And I think that only happened once. I mean, it never happened again. So God is faithful. When you think about giving, in Malachi it says, where God says, "Prove me if I will not open the windows of heaven and pour out a blessing." And the way I look at that, it's not like we became wealthy or anything like that, but I've seen increase over the years. And even times when we lost income for one reason or another, God was still faithful. We actually continued just paying our tithe on the original income before our income had taken a step down. And there were reasons for that, which I won't go into. But what I would say in that, no matter what times we were in, God always provided for us. And sometimes there was supernatural payment of debts that came. And if you ask me now, well, how did that happen? I don't even know how it happened in some cases. I know I'm going in all kinds of different areas. But when we had our baby, when we were down at Bible school, our daughter, Carrie, we didn't have insurance. And so we had to pay the doctor out of pocket, and we had to pay him in full by the 7th month of my pregnancy. And I believe we did do that, but the hospital bill was a whole nother thing. And so Jerry had gone in, we had started making payments to the hospital. We didn't have much that we could give, but they were willing to accept whatever we could pay, every week or every month or whatever it was. Well, Jerry had gone in at one point to the finance officer at the hospital where she was born and sat down with the finance person there, and they forgave the debt. Like, he walked out of there and they said, we're just gonna wipe this off, our books. You don't owe us anything. And so that's supernatural. And we didn't ask for it. He was just going in there to talk to them about how he could arrange and how long it might take for us to actually pay this bill. So those are some of the things that happened, but there were other things that happened as well. And it was supernatural. God always provided, and that's what I can say. So this is a topic on worship, but I guess I'm telling you, your giving is worship to God. And how about we take our tithes and our offerings and we worship God with them? That we spend time when we write our check, or when we're giving online, or when we're texting to give, we spend a moment and we connect with the heart of our Father. And we just say, it's our love and it's our pleasure to give this back into your hands. And I think that would be something that will improve all of our experiences in our times of worship, and also in our times of giving, which again, I think is worship. So didn't intend to go there, but hopefully it helps somebody out there. And generosity is our joy. And I also believe that giving is part of our worship. So, all right, well, we'll pick up again next week and talk more about worship. And I hope you have a wonderful week.